Okay, good morning, people. I see people are starting to appear. So Jenna's here. Good morning, Jenna. And Cindy's here. And Aliana's here. Good morning. Adalbert's here. Good morning to you. Lim is here. And I think that's Lily and Casey and Mashid. Good morning to all of you. Again, some of you. Ying is here. Good morning. Who else do we have? Karen's here. Hi, Karen. Ella's here. Good evening, Ella. I know it's a different time there. Well, actually, it might be technically morning there. Who else do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, that's about everyone. Okay, good. So I'm sure more people will trickle in, or at least I hope they'll trickle in shortly. What we'll do today, is, good morning, Min. What we'll do today is we'll talk a little bit more about culture, and then I think we will start to get into human evolution and prehistory. I'll have to be careful because I think human evolution is really interesting, and if I'm not careful, I'll get sucked into it. But we really don't need to deal with it that much in this class. So I'm just going to try and steer clear to it, but it's super interesting to me, and I could sort of get lost in it more than we need to. So I'll try not to do that. Okay, so I'm glad you're all here. I hope you all had a really good weekend, or as good a weekend as you can when you're, social distancing and all that stuff. But I think somehow my mic got muted there. I'm not sure when or why, but anyway, here we go. So last week, if I remember, hey Sabrina, last week we were talking about what culture was, and we said that it was a system of values and beliefs that and behaviors and physical things that good morning, Faye, that allow people to kind of cooperate and to live in a social group, right? And we said that it was critically important to understand what a culture was because human beings don't come programmed with any real software of our own, right? When we're born, when we're little babies, we can't care for ourselves. We can't do anything, right? Good morning, Carmen. We can't do anything on our own, and so we need to be taught. Well, actually, for a number of years of early life, we have to be cared for by parents or grandparents. But then, even after that, we continually need to be taught, right? We need to be taught how to operate in human society. And so we said that there were kind of 4 aspects of culture, that culture was symbolic. We use symbols in society, in human interaction. We are very symbolic communicators, right? All of our words are symbols for something else. Hand gestures that we use, facial expressions that we use, those are symbols for something else. The way we dress, the way we walk, these sort of art that we create, whether it's visual art or whether it's music or whatever, we are very symbolic communicators, and those symbols are kind of very tightly connected to each other, and so using one symbol often triggers associations and triggers associations with other meaning as well. So we're very symbolic communicators, us humans are. The second one we talked about was the idea that culture is learned, right? So all of us go through this process of enculturation, right? Our parents, our grandparents, people around us in the community, they teach us how to be humans, right? They teach us how to be members of the group. And so all of us have gone through, and maybe are still going through, that period of enculturation, that period of sort of downloading our cultural software so that we can cooperate with other members of our group. we said that culture functions as an integrated whole, right? So there are different parts of culture, they are all connected to each other, and they all sort of work together to give people what they need to take care of people, because that's what culture is, right? Culture is an adaptation to an environment. And so a culture has to allow people to, a group of people, to be successful and get the things that they need. And so all of those things within a culture have to work together in order to serve the people. Good morning, Jimmy, again. And good morning, Sam, again. Culture is integrated. Oh, yeah. And so on Friday, I described the situation of the Kapuku people from New Guinea. And I said that their political life, so the way of sort of determining who's the high status man in society, their marriage patterns, and their economic life, so men exchanging pigs with each other and wives providing sweet potatoes to their husbands, both of those things were, or all of those things were kind of integrated and connected with one another. And so if something changes in society, other things have to change to adopt. Good morning, Michael, and good morning, Lisa, as well. Good morning to both of you. And finally, we said that culture was shared. So culture was something that we do as a group, but you can't actually, nope, that's okay, Manish, good morning. Culture is something we do as a group, but you can really only see culture happening when you look at one-on-one interactions between people. You can't just sort of stand back and look at culture, because culture's invisible, right? You have to look at how people behave and interact with each other, and that's what tells you what culture is and how it works, right? Oh yeah, and I think the last thing we talked about on Friday were these concepts of ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, and the question was how do we treat cultural beliefs and behaviors that are different from our own? And so if you remember, I used a very extreme example of the Aztecs, a First Nations or an indigenous people from Central America, from what's now Mexico. And I described to you a very bloody human sacrifice ritual, which the Aztecs would engage in, right? They would cut people's hearts out and offer them to the sun god so that the sun god could continue to be successful in his battle in the underworld and then rise again the next morning. And so it was very important for the Aztecs to sort of feed the gods in this way. But looked at from outside, it was a very kind of bloody and violent and kind of awful ritual, right? And so we talked a little bit about it on Friday, and what I was trying to illustrate to you is these two concepts of ethnocentrism. So when we're looking at another culture, or when we're looking at another culture's beliefs or values or practices, we can kind of look at things from two perspectives, right? We can look at things, we can judge other cultures according to the values of our own culture. We can judge cultural practices or beliefs through our own values, and that's being ethnocentric, or we can be culturally relativistic. So we can suspend judgment and try to understand why a culture is doing things a certain way or believing certain things, and we try to understand it from their point of view, not from ours. Okay, so there were kind of two ways to look at cultures that were different from our own, and one of the things that I tried to demonstrate or try to explain to you was this idea that the interesting thing about the Aztecs and the Spanish, who eventually sort of destroyed their culture, is that their values were actually not quite so different, right? both the Spanish and the Aztecs believed in their gods and the fact that they should honor and obey their gods. Um, Both cultures had a belief about the sacredness of human life, right? They both held those same beliefs, but the way those beliefs were kind of played out in society were quite different, right? And so when the Aztecs looked at the Spanish, they saw a bunch of bloodthirsty barbarians, right? But when the Spanish looked at the Aztecs, they also saw a bunch of bloodthirsty barbarians. And so both sides were looking at things through a lens of ethnocentrism, right? Both of them were kind of judging the other culture based on their own beliefs. And so generally as anthropologists, we don't want to do that, right? We want to try to understand why a culture does what it does from the inside, right? We want to understand how certain beliefs kind of fit together and help the society to survive and accomplish its goals. That's kind of what we want to do. Now, there's some gray area around that, but maybe we'll get to that a little bit later in the class, and I'll just kind of leave that for now. Yeah, so ethnocentric views, or viewing things ethnocentrically, can prevent us from really being able to properly understand other cultures, right? And if we are culturally relativistic, then we're not going to judge them. We're going to try and understand a culture on their own terms. Okay. Oh yeah, and on Friday I asked you to do a little bit of homework for me. I asked you to send me a picture and a little description about something that is culturally meaningful. I'll try and look at those a little bit later today and maybe give you some feedback on them tomorrow. Okay. Yeah, I'll try to give you some feedback on that tomorrow. Okay, let's see where we are here. Oh, right. Okay. I wanted to spend just a little bit of time talking about anthropological theory. Theory is probably everyone's least favorite thing to study. Sometimes it feels a little bit boring. Sometimes it feels a little bit difficult to understand. And that's okay. We're only going to just touch on these theories just so we get an idea of a few things. Number one, that all scientific disciplines have theoretical frameworks. So they have ways in which they try to understand and explain things. And I want to show you that there are different frameworks, right? There are different ways of looking at the same thing. And sometimes there are different scientists that have different viewpoints. And so they might be kind of arguing to see whose viewpoint is more accurate or better at explaining things. And sometimes there are theoretical frameworks that change through time. And so a theoretical framework can start out this way and then it can kind of evolve and change. Sometimes theoretical frameworks get thrown out because they're not useful anymore, or they don't really do a good job of explaining what people see. But I did want to take just a little time and talk about a few of these theoretical frameworks, a few of these theories, just so that we have been exposed to them. And actually, we've already used a few of them already, believe it or not. We just haven't mentioned what they are. So this is what we'll say a theory is, okay? A theory is a tool that scientists use to understand and explain and make predictions about subject matter. And so if any of you have taken biology, or if you've taken chemistry, or if you've taken physics, let's take chemistry. If you've taken chemistry, you've probably seen a model of what an atom looks like, right? It's something with a nucleus and protons and neutrons, and there's electrons sort of zipping around them. You've probably seen a model of the atom that looks something like that. And of course, if you could shrink yourself down and see an atom, it wouldn't look anything like the model, but the model's helpful for explaining how atoms work and how atoms interact and how they and how they bind with each other, right? So the model or the theoretical framework is not perfect, but it helps us to understand what we're seeing and what things kind of happen. And so it's the same thing with other sciences too. We need models and we need theoretical frameworks that help us to explain how things work. And so I just want to walk you through a few um, a few theoretical frameworks in anthropology. I'm going to keep it really, really simple because I don't want us to get sort of confused or bogged down in this, okay? Um, and some of them are not so much in use anymore, or at least one of them isn't. So let me start with this one. This social evolution was a sort of a theoretical framework that was formed very early in anthropology's history, and it was an attempt to explain why we have different societies. And so in particular, people in Western European countries who were into social science at the time were trying to explain why we had sort of rich, developed, technologically sophisticated societies like we had in Britain or in France, and then why in some parts of the world were people still living in huts and sort of just fishing and hunting? Why was there this kind of obvious difference in technological development and maybe complexity between these two societies? What was behind it? Why were societies so different? Okay, that was kind of the question that these anthropologists were trying to ask. And so some of them, I think this is Lewis Henry Morgan, I think they come up with an idea that, well, all societies progress through certain stages. And so they created this 3-stage system where all human societies started in this state of savagery. They kind of evolved over time into a state of barbarism, and then eventually they became civilizations. Okay, and so these early anthropologists thought that each of these stages had particular types of political organization or marriage types or families or religions, and so they assumed that every society evolved through the same stages. But this kind of theory wasn't really built on very much. Okay, it was a very kind of racist theory that assumed that Western European societies were the most developed and the most evolved, and everyone else was less developed and they were just kind of trying to get there, right? And so if they could move through their stages of savagery and barbarism, that eventually they could become civilized too. They could be as good as Western European civilizations. And of course, today we recognize that as ridiculous. But of course, there was a lot more racism back then than there is now. And so these early anthropologists looked at things through a very racist lens, and they looked at other cultures as kind of being less than them. But, you know, eventually they could be as good as Western Europe, which again is ridiculous, but that's what these guys thought at the time. And so so social evolutionists believe that all societies had to pass through these stages, and that actually warfare was what encouraged societies to develop. And so the more conflicts that a society had, the quicker it would evolve, and the quicker it would sort of become civilized like Western Europe. But again, it's a flawed theory, right? Again, it assumes that all societies will go through the same process, right? It assumes that all societies will evolve the same way. And this is not true, right? All societies are different. They live in different parts of the world in different circumstances, and they all have different histories. And so all societies do not evolve in the same way. Okay, so that didn't work. The second thing it didn't work, of course, is that there was a pretty strong feeling of racism in social evolution. And so again, the idea is that, you know, the the peak of human development was Western European civilization, and that everyone else, eventually will evolve and sort of become civilized like Western Europe. And that's not really a useful way to look at it, and it's not true, right? Western Europe was not better or more evolved than other societies. It was richer, and it was more technologically complex, and it was more powerful, but that doesn't mean that every culture is trying to get there. And so in the social evolution here, there were some problematic ideas, and so in the early part of the 1900s, this theory got thrown out, and it's not really in use anymore. We don't look at things this way, okay? But anthropologists did, 150 years ago. Yeah, so it's too simplistic, as you can see here. Um, all societies don't go through the same evolutionary process. That's not true. And again, it was pretty racist, and it was based on ideas that we have demonstrated as false. Okay. Now, the second one here is historical particularism, and this one's actually quite useful in some ways because it introduced anthropologists to the idea that every society, every culture has its own history. Okay, it has its own kind of origin story, if you will. And because of that, you can only understand every culture based on that origin story and based on the environment that it appears in. So all societies are not the same, and they're not going to evolve the same way if you just give them enough time. Cultures become what they are because of their history and because of where they live. Anthropologists who were into historical particularism also felt that you could find some universal laws, so you could figure out some ways in which all cultures worked, but that they didn't really have enough data at the time to do it. And so in the first half of the 20th century, so in the early 1900s, anthropologists were big into historical particularism. And one of the benefits of this theoretical framework was that it started to remove racism from anthropology. And so anthropology started out in a pretty racist context, but has become better since. And so historical particularism helped out with that. It helped us see every society as different, and the fact that one society isn't better than another, one culture isn't better than another. Another one I'll talk about here is functionalism. And so this is the idea that culture is an interrelated whole. And so here you can see, just like a human being has, that's okay, Luan. Just like a human has various organs in your body and they all kind of work together, cultures and societies are like that as well, right? And we've actually talked about this already, right? We talked about this idea that culture is integrated, right? It has all these different parts that work together, just like the Kapuku and their pigs and their marriages and all that. And so that was kind of a functionalist perspective, right? We looked at that issue through a functionalist perspective to see how the different parts of culture operated to make the culture, as a whole, meet the needs of people, right? So that was a functionalist idea. We didn't sort of label it that way, label it as that at the time, but that's what it is. And so, again, this has become part of the common sense of anthropologists, right? We generally look at big pieces of culture like religion and family and marriage and production and try to see how those things are connected to each other. And so functionalism continues to be one way in which we look at culture. Okay. Another one that's still in use here is cultural ecology. So the idea that cultures are pretty strongly related to their environment. Okay, and so if you think about it, imagine a culture that lives way, way up in the Arctic. Okay, so way, way up where it's, snowy and cold, and there's ice, and there's no trees or grass because everything's covered in snow and ice. A culture that lives in an environment like that is going to be completely different from one that lives in the Amazon rainforest, right? I think we could all have an intuitive sense of that being true, right? That living in the Arctic is a totally different world from living in an Amazon rainforest. And so those cultures are going to have different beliefs. They're going to see the world differently. They're going to interact with the world differently because they really live in different physical worlds, right? They live in totally different environments. And so that's kind of what cultural ecology is about. It's the idea that cultures develop within an environment just like organisms do, right? Frogs are the way they are because they kind of live in the water and swim around, right? Frogs wouldn't live in a desert. They wouldn't evolve in a desert because that's a totally different environment, right? So the idea here is that the environment plays a very important role in the development of a culture. Okay, and again, I think that we all probably have a fairly intuitive grasp of that, right? I think it's not hard to understand how living in a desert or living in frozen Arctic or living in a rainforest, yeah, that's a totally different experience, right? And cultures are going to develop differently because of it. I think we could all understand that pretty easily. Um, Structural anthropology. This is one that might come up as well. It will definitely come up in social justice, actually. Um, the idea here is that two things. One, that somehow, in some way, all cultures operate the same. Okay? And so the metaphor I'll use here, I'll go back to my car metaphor, all right? So if you have two cars, so if you have a Lamborghini and if you have one of those little Austin Minis, those little cute cars, if you have those two cars side by side, they're totally different, right? They're totally different prices. They look different. They have different performance. They have a different driving experience. Everything about those two cars is different. But if you look inside, both of them operate in very similar ways, right? Both of them have an internal combustion engine, right? Both of them have an engine that burns gas. Both of them have tires that move them down the road. You sit in a seat and turn a wheel to get it to go where you want it to. So those two cars, even though they're very different, they're going to have a lot of similar parts to them, right? A lot of the parts of the cars are the same. However, the way that those parts interact with each other and sort of how those parts are designed is totally different, right? You can't take a piece of the engine of the Lamborghini and put it into the Austin Mini, right? You can't do it. It won't work. And so part of structuralism is the idea that cultures have a lot of similar pieces to them, but sometimes they work differently, right? The part in the Lamborghini is going to work a little differently than the part in the Austin Mini. Okay, so even though both of them are cars, they're different cars and they work differently. And so structuralists say the same thing. Cultures have some similar pieces to them, but sometimes they work differently, right? They work differently than you think they do. The second part of this is this idea about dialectics, and we'll talk about this definitely in social justice. We might talk about it a little bit in this class. I guess we'll see. I'm not sure how much it'll come up. But this is the idea that every situation has two opposing things and then their resolution. So these things are sometimes called binary opposites. Okay, so you can see here we've got ideas such as high and low, inside and outside, people and animals, life and death, good and bad, bright and dark, wet and dry. I mean, us humans are constantly, man and woman, we're constantly creating opposites for ourselves, right? We're understanding the world in our heads through extremes, right? You're this or that. And then we have to kind of find a medium point, right? We have to find a compromise between those two ideas. And so structuralists look at culture as the thing that figures out the balance, right? So what does it mean to be good? What does it mean to be bad? And how do we find the middle ground? Okay. Here's a quick example for you. There's the truth, right? And there's lies, right? Things that are true and things that are totally false. Now, should you always tell the truth? Maybe I'll ask you that in the comments here. Should you always tell the truth? That's my question to you. Should you tell the truth all the time, no matter what? Should you tell the truth all the time, no matter what? What's your answer to that? No? No, not always. Sabrina says no. No. Casey says no. Interesting. Well, it's not interesting. That's kind of what I thought you would say. Not if it would hurt someone. No. No. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting, right? Because if you think of binary opposites, binary for two, opposite for opposite. If you think of these two ideas, truth and lies, or true and false, not always, yeah, no. Yeah, this is interesting because we all have a very intuitive, sometimes a white lie is okay, yeah. Culture has to figure that out, right? Because culture has set up, to lie is generally bad, right? I think we can agree that lying to people is generally bad. Telling the truth is generally good, right? And when we're kids, I think we're taught that we should always tell the truth, right? But culture has to find a middle ground because, like you've all mentioned, you can't tell people the truth about everything all the time, right? Sometimes the truth is hurtful, right? Sometimes the truth is damaging. And so there are instances where maybe telling the truth isn't the best thing, right? However, that doesn't mean that we want to lie all the time either, right? Lying all the time is also super destructive. If it's being nice, a lie is okay, yeah. But that statement, Michael, what you said there, if it's being nice, a lie is okay. And I think Ella's probably talking about that with her little white lies too, or Eliana, not if it would hurt someone. Those are cultural ideas, right? Our culture has kind of figured out, when is it okay to lie? Well, maybe if it's just a little one, right? If it's just a little lie, it's okay. Or if your lie is little and telling it would hurt somebody else, then maybe it's okay to lie. But that doesn't mean it's okay to lie all the time, right? And so you can see this is this dialectical process, right? We have two extremes, telling the truth and telling lies, and our culture has to figure out a middle ground, right? When is it okay to lie, and when should we tell the truth? And so structuralists say that this is kind of the job of culture, is to figure out the middle ground between two extremes, to figure out how we should behave when we could do this thing or that thing. What should we do? Does that make sense? I think. Hopefully it does. So people often think of the world in binary opposites, two opposite things, and culture can help us to figure out what to do with that. Culture can help us figure out how do we sort of walk the path between two extremes, and neither of those extremes is probably good, right? It's not good to tell the truth all the time because it can be hurtful to people, but it's definitely not a good idea to lie all the time either. So we need to find a middle ground, and culture helps us do that. Another one is symbolic and interpretive anthropology. So this is the idea that culture lies in individuals' interpretations of events and things around them. And so this is kind of what we did a little bit of this on Thursday and Friday when we talked about the chess game, when we talked about the football game. And in your homework, I kind of asked you, it might have been a little unfair of me to do this because it's early, but I just wanted to see what you would come up with. But that's kind of what I asked you to do in your homework, right? This was symbolic or interpretive anthropology. What does it mean to people to play this sport, or to like this music, or to behave in this way? What does it mean? What does it symbolize? That's what symbolic anthropology is about. And so we've done a little bit of that as well. Again, when we talked about what things mean to people, how does a culture express itself through its symbols, right? And so football and chess were good examples, I think, of how a culture could express the things that it found important, its values and beliefs, through its symbols, right? Symbolically. Okay, and the last one is postmodernism. I don't know if you've ever heard of things that are postmodern or postmodernism. This is a tricky one to define. The idea behind postmodernism is that there is no objective truth. There is not one way to see the world. And that's because each of us are looking at the world through our own eyes. We're interpreting the world based on our own culture and our own history, the things that have happened to us. And because of that, there's no right way to see the world, right? Every one of us has a unique perspective on what the world is like and what society is like. And so how do we decide, right? How do we decide whose reality is the right one if nobody's is the right one? And postmodernists like to argue that the versions of reality that are seen as true has to do with who has power in society. And so let's say in basically all societies, men are the ones that have power, right? So here in Western society, even though we are trying to take steps toward equality for men and women, men are still the ones that are in power. And so men's version of reality, men's view of the world, tends to be the one that people see as real or actual. Okay? This is something we probably won't dig into so much in this class. I don't think we'll deal very much with postmodernism in comparative cultures here, but it will definitely play an important role in social justice. Okay? Because again, we will be looking a lot at who believes what and how that's connected to inequality within society. Okay, so postmodernism sometimes is a little bit controversial in anthropology and in other disciplines, but it's something that you may bump into in other classes, and it's something that we will grapple with in social justice. So I thought I'd mention it here. I don't know that we'll deal with it very much, but there are lots of postmodernists floating around in anthropology as well. Again, it's a little difficult to get your head around sometimes, but that's basically what it is. The idea that there's no such thing as objective reality or objective knowledge. Okay, let me check in with you here at this point. I know that was probably complicated, but on a scale of 1 to 10, how much sense did that make? Those theoretical frameworks. Did that make sense to you? Are you okay with that? Was it totally confusing? So on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being totally confusing, I don't get it, and 10 being, yep, I totally understand what you were talking about. What do you think? Give me a quick 1 to 10 rating of how that is. Ooh, look at you guys. 9s and 8.5 and 8. Ooh. Some 7s. Okay. Well, either you all are smarter than me, or I'm just doing a really good job explaining it, because I always struggled with the theory part in classes. So this is encouraging to see if it's accurate, but that's good. Okay, I'm happy with that. I'll try to point out, places where we can use these theories as we go a little bit further, okay? And again, postmodernism is probably not one that we'll touch again. Social evolution, we definitely won't, because it's pretty racist and nobody uses it. But other ones like symbolic and interpretive anthropology or cultural ecology, I'll try to sort of bring those back into what we're doing and see if we can use them, okay? But that's good. All right. Okay. So let's switch gears a little bit and start to talk about prehistory. Now, we won't spend a whole lot of time here. Again, I mentioned that I really find this human evolution stuff interesting, and so I could spend more time in it, but I'm going to restrain myself and not go into it. Because again, this course is about comparative culture, and there's not a huge amount of evidence for culture in prehistory, right? Most of culture is up here, right? Most of culture is beliefs and values and practices. And when you don't have any written records, you don't really know what people were thinking. And so prior to the development of writing about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago, we don't really know a lot about what people were doing culturally. We know bits about how they evolved. We have some of their technology. Sometimes we know where they moved or what they ate, maybe what diseases they had or what they might have died from. But that's really all we have. We don't really know what they were thinking about, because thought doesn't preserve, right, in the archaeological record. You can't tell what people were thinking 10,000 years ago unless they were to write it down, right? And so we can't spend too much time here because there's not a ton of evidence for culture, but I do want to spend just a little bit of time setting it up, because to kind of know what we are, you have to kind of know what we came from or where we came from. Yeah, so why we're in this unit here of prehistory is the basic question that no other animal has culture, right? No other animal passes on a series of beliefs and values and behaviors to its offspring in the way that we do. We are totally unique in this way. And so where does culture come from? How does it originate and how does it evolve? That's the question here. And so the question is answered by paleoanthropologists. So these are anthropologists that look at human evolution. So paleo is for old, anthro for man or for human, and logos is the way, right? So the way of people from the deep past. That's what paleoanthropologists look at. And so often what paleoanthropologists are looking at are kind of the roots of our family tree, so how we have evolved. Now, some of you may have heard or watched documentaries or saw things about human evolution. And the problem with human evolution is that it's been very difficult to figure out what our evolutionary history is. There's not a huge amount of remains from this period in terms of bones or fossil bones. And a lot of them are kind of broken and spread out over distances, and so it's been difficult to sort of figure out what the picture is in terms of our evolution. If you looked at our family tree, our evolutionary family tree, you would see something that looks like this. You can show this in a lot of different ways. But you can see that we are mammals, right? So anyone with some biology background should know that we're mammals, right? We are warm-blooded animals that have fur, and we give birth to babies that are alive, right? We don't lay eggs or anything weird like that. We are mammals, and so we're related to other mammals. And here you can see on this slide here, I have a few things in red boxes. And so the first thing I just want to point out to you in this smaller red box at the bottom is an animal called Netharctus. And so Netharctus, if you know what lemurs look like, Netharctus is probably most like a lemur. But Netharctus is an animal that we have fossil bones from about 50 million years ago. And so Netharctus is kind of interesting to us because it was probably the first primate. And so Netharctus is probably the ancestor to all apes, all monkeys, and to us. Okay, and if you look at Netharctus, again, you would see something that looks like a lemur. If you don't know what a lemur is, you can Google them after. They're super fun, super interesting little primates. But one of the things that they have that's very similar to us, even though they look different, is they have a hand that looks like us. They have kind of a palm, they have long fingers, they have a kind of a thumb that sticks out, and they don't have any claws. They have fingernails like we do. And so this hand that we use for everything, this hand is something that comes to us from our very deep evolutionary past. This hand is kind of 50 million years old, and of course it's evolved differently in different primates, but we all kind of share it, and we get it from this Netharctus creature 50 million years ago. And then I've got a little box around, or a larger box around the top. And so the top part of our family tree is a collection of animals that are similar to us in that they are bipedal. And so bi for two and ped for foot. So all of those animals in the top of that family tree walk on 2 feet. And that's kind of a strange thing too, right? If you think of animals that you know, most of them move on 4 feet, right? To walk around all the time on 2 feet is a very odd way to get around for an animal. But of course, it's something that we do. And it seems to be something that evolved maybe around 5 million years ago or so. We see the first primates, the first apes really, that are walking on 2 feet. And some of those are ancestors to us. So here's Netharctus. I just want to show you very quickly our very humble origins. Netharctus is probably the first primate, and so it is an ancestor to all monkeys, to all apes, to gorillas, to chimpanzees, to us. This is our great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, this odd little creature here. And again, it had hands very similar to ours, right? With 5 fingers that could grab onto things. Yeah, and that's kind of all we need to know about him. Our more recent family tree, again, looks like this. And so you can see here, starting around maybe 5 or 6 million years ago, we have the first species that walk on 2 feet. And so currently, paleoanthropologists are trying to put together what the relationships between all of these species are. And so you can see there's Latin names all over here, like Ardipithecus ramidus and Australopithecus anamensis and afarensis. Those are all species that came before us. And so they are all bipedal, so they all walk on 2 feet. They are all hominids, so they are part of our family tree that includes us and great apes and chimpanzees and things like that. And some of them may be related to us and some of them may not be. And again, the fossil record is not as complete as we might like it to be, and it's been difficult to figure out exactly what our evolutionary path has been. But we are related to, we are genetically related to and related to by evolution these earlier versions of bipedal primates that came before us. I think that's about all I want to say about them. Again, I could go full into this, but I'm trying to restrain myself. So maybe what we'll do at this point is we'll take a little break. I know we've been working hard and there was a lot of theory stuff, even though you guys seem to have crushed it anyway. Let's take a little break, 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a little more about this evolution thing, okay? So let's take 10 minutes. Okay, and we're back. So, we were in the process of talking very briefly about human evolution, right? And like I showed you, I'm just going to switch to my slideshow here. Bipedal primates, so apes that walked on 2 feet, have an evolutionary history probably about 5 million years long. We are only a very recent version of bipedal hominid, and so if you look at the chart on the screen, you'll see Homo sapiens there, one of those little blue blocks, and that's us. We're Homo sapiens. We've only been around about 300,000 years, believe it or not. And so if you think about it, there have been apes running around on 2 feet for a long, long time, and most of them weren't us. And even more interesting is the fact that if you see all of these species, some of these species were living on Earth at the same time. And so think about this. We're very used to being the only things that look like us on the planet, right? There's nothing really like a human being on the planet. But for most of the history of our ancestors, there actually were, right? There were multiple species of bipedal primate running around, and those things were similar to us, but then also different. And so it's interesting to think about how strange that would be to have other species of human being kind of walking around. But in the past, that's exactly what the case was. There were multiple versions of bipedal hominids. And again, we're only the most recent version of that type of animal. But again, we're a very different one. Most of our ancestors were not nearly as intelligent as we are. Here's a little, this is kind of a funny, these are some kind of funny pictures, but what these are facial reconstructions of what some of our bipedal primate ancestors might have looked like. Now, what you're kind of looking at here is a little mix of science and art. Scientifically, we have the skulls of these creatures, and we know basically how primate faces are constructed. We know where the muscles attach and how they normally function. But there's a lot of stuff we don't know about how these animals looked as well. And so again, this is kind of half art and half science. But it's interesting to kind of look at these guys and kind of imagine them running around Africa millions of years ago, and eventually kind of evolving into us. Now, again, I'm not going to go too deep into this, but I do want to point out one hominid in particular, and that's Homo habilis. And you can see Homo habilis is one of the blue blocks there, living around 2.5 to 2 million years ago. And I point Homo habilis out for a couple of reasons. One is that Homo habilis is the first member of our genus, and so each species name has 2 parts, right? A genus and a species, and we're Homo sapiens, and this is Homo habilis. So this is kind of the first member of our family right here. The second reason why I bring Homo habilis up is that Homo habilis is the first hominid to use tools, okay? And before this, we really have no evidence of tool use by hominids. It's possible that they were using wooden tools, but of course those don't preserve in the archaeological record, and so we don't really know if they were using tools. But when we start finding the remains of Homo habilis around 2.5 million years ago, we start finding stone tools with them as well. And to see these stone tools, I should have put a picture in here, but I'll put a picture in for you tomorrow. to see these stone tools created by Homo habilis, they're not very impressive. Um, if you looked at one, you would think it just looks like a broken stone. That's all it is. And so, certainly from our perspective, their technology is not impressive in any way. Um, the way it is impressive, however, is the fact that there are many, many, many of them in the archaeological record. We have found tons of these little stone tools made by Homo habilis for almost 1,000,000 years, and they're all reasonably the same. They're all a round stone that has been broken in a certain way to make a sharp edge. And we think what Homo habilis might have been doing with these is using them to scavenge from killed animals. And so if you imagine if you're living in Africa and lions kill a zebra, and the lions sort of descend on the zebra and they pull all the guts out of it and they eat the guts, and then they eat all the meat and they pull it all apart, there's not really that much left, right? And so a little hominid like Homo habilis, they were probably short. They were probably only about 4.5 feet tall, maybe 5 feet tall. They were kind of small. These animals might come later and they might find that there was really no meat left. But what they could do, Homo habilis, with this tool, is they could break open the skulls of these animals and actually eat the brains, right? Most large carnivores like lions and leopards and things, they actually can't get their mouth around the skull of an animal to crack it open and get at the brains. And so often the brains are left there and it's kind of bugs and things like that that eat the brains. But this creature, this little Homo habilis creature, could come along and open up the skull with his little stone tool. And then they'd have this new source of food. The same thing with other bones too. You could break them open and get at the marrow inside that sometimes larger carnivores do and sometimes they don't. But Homo habilis could do this. And so starting to use these stone tools, even though the tool itself is not impressive, it did give them the opportunity to access a new food source, a food source that really no other animal could access. And so that wound up being a huge advantage for Homo habilis. But the other thing, and the reason why I bring Homo habilis up here, is that they learned how to create these stone tools. And then once they learned, they passed it on, right? Because I said that they had been making these stone tools for 1,000,000 years. So generation after generation, Homo habilis parents were teaching their Homo habilis children how to make these stone tools and how to survive. And so really what that is, and the reason I bring it up, is that's really the beginning of culture, right? This patterned behavior that Homo habilis does, this thing that it makes in the same way every time, and then it teaches its children to do that, and its children teach its children to do that. And so it gets passed on. And so it doesn't look anything like culture does for... Hi. Are you interrupting? Are you interrupting? Come here. Yeah, I know. And so it doesn't look anything like culture that we are used to seeing, right? We're talking about culture in terms of beliefs and values and things like that. And Homo habilis arguably has no beliefs or values to speak of, right? Here what we're looking at is patterns of behavior, but still those patterns of behavior are passed on from generation to generation to generation. And that's exactly what culture is, right? Culture is transmitted behavior from one generation to the next, right? And so that seems to start with Homo habilis about 2.5 million years ago. And so that's why I want to point out this particular species, not because it's, impressive or in any way, but because this is arguably where culture starts. And of course, all of those other things, those beliefs and values and things will come along later. So a couple of things that became important for human evolution. Okay, the first one was the fact that our ancestors stood on 2 feet, right? That made everything else possible for humans, right? One of the things that we do is we make tools and we use tools, but to do that, we have to actually have hands, right? We can't be using these to run around like this creature does. So standing up on 2 feet allowed us to have these hands free to carry things and to use tools. That was an important adaptation or evolution that our ancestors had. The second one is that we have brains that are unique in terms of our structure and our development. And so our brains are reasonably large considering our body size, but we don't have the largest brains around, right? Whales have much larger brains than you and I. But our brains are constructed in a certain way. We have a lot of neurons. Those neurons are very interconnected. And we have certain structures in our brain that not every species has as well. And so our brains have developed in a very specific way that give us the ability to do things that not every animal can, right? Humans evolved a very strong attachment system. Again, when we're born, we have no ability to take care of ourselves in any way, right? We're helpless little children that cannot survive without the care of our parents, right? And so human beings have a very strong attachment system, right? They are driven to connect and attach to other people. At first, our parents or whoever takes care of us when we're a baby. And then later on, other people in life too, right? Our friends, our girlfriend, boyfriend, / husband / wife. Those people we are driven to attach to. And of course, if that bond is broken, right? If somebody dies or if a marriage breaks up or something like that, that can be intensely painful for humans. And part of the reason why it's so painful is because we have a strong attachment system. But that attachment system is super beneficial in terms of keeping humans together and ensuring that they cooperate with each other. Yeah, I have this last point here, but I'm not sure what I wanted to say about it, so I think I'm just going to skip it until I remember, okay? So very quickly, how are we doing? Is that okay with human evolution? Are you good with that? I don't think I want to dig into it any deeper than I just did, because the danger would be I would spend a week on it, and we don't have time for that. So what we'll do now is I think I will send you to the textbook. As you'll probably recall, the textbook is on Student Portal under Course Documents. And what I would like you to do is to read the first few pages and then answer a few questions, okay? And so you'll see here, what are some of the factors that led to hominid bipedalism? So why did our ancestors start walking on 2 feet to begin with? The second one, how did climate affect hominid development? And so what was the environment like in terms of allowing our ancestors to walk on 2 feet? How and why did Homo sapiens expand out of Africa? So what you'll read about is that our species, Homo sapiens, evolves in Africa, but eventually they leave. And so the question is why? And then finally, how and when did Homo sapiens, humans, when did they populate the Americas? Okay. So I've got 4 kind of simple questions for you here. What I would like to say about this is, let's see, I think it'll probably take you till almost the end of class to finish these. And so I would like you to read and answer those questions, but I also want to ask you to, first of all, type out answers to the questions, because eventually I would like you to put them into the live chat here. And so it'll be quicker if they're already typed. You won't have to sort of type them in on the fly. So type out your answers to these questions, but resist the temptation to simply copy and paste from the text, right? There's no value in just copying and pasting. You don't really learn anything. I want you to answer these in your own words as best you can, okay? So don't copy and paste. Answer the questions in your own words. Type them out either in a notepad app on your phone or on your laptop or whatever, so that you can just quickly copy and paste them into the live chat as we go, okay? That'll sort of keep things moving fairly quickly, okay? Yeah, so I think it'll probably take you the rest of the time to finish that, and so I think what I'll do is I'll leave you to do that. It might be a little more time than you need, but I don't think we'll have time to get into it at the end, so I'll just let you do it. And is it homework? Yeah, Michael. First thing tomorrow we will start with answering these questions from the textbook. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Are there any questions that I can answer for you right now? What about you? You have any questions? No? Okay. Maybe you do? Maybe you have a question? Let's see. Don't send me the answers. Just hang on to them until tomorrow, and then we'll deal with them. So they're just for you for right now. Okay. All right, let's see. I'll just give you a few more seconds there. This cat will walk across the camera. What time is it due? We'll start on those questions first thing in class, first thing tomorrow morning, Aliana. Okay. Ella's okay. Ying's okay. All right. So I'll leave you then to read this little section of the text on prehistory, answer some questions. We'll talk about them first thing in class tomorrow, and then I've got lots of other stuff to show you as well. So I'll leave you to do that. It was a pleasure talking to you all this morning. If you have any questions, I'll put those questions in Microsoft Teams so that you can see them as well. If you have any questions, I'll be available in Microsoft Teams and I can answer any questions for you. But otherwise, I think I'll sign off for now. So yeah, it's nice interacting with you all today. And I'll talk to you at the latest. I'll talk to you first thing tomorrow. Okay, so bye.